Per Voigt, immediately after sending off the manuscript of the first part, Marx had set to work on the chapter on capital. Duncker declared himself willing to continue with the publication, but the whole project was engulfed by the enormous dimensions taken on by Marx's quarrel with Karl Voigt. This quarrel, which occupied Marx for 18 months, is a striking example both of Marx's ability to expend tremendous labor on essentially trivial matters and also of his talent for vituperation. Voigt had been a leader of the left wing in the Frankfurt Assembly, though not left enough to avoid being attacked by the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, and on the dissolution of the Assembly he had emigrated to Switzerland, where he taught geography at the University of Bern. He was the author of several works preaching a crude materialism and was a member of the Swiss Diet. On the outbreak of the Franco-Austrian War, which had been engineered by Bonaparte and Cavour to loosen Austria's hold on North Italy, Voigt started a paper in Switzerland whose main editorial line was that Germany would benefit from Austria's defeat and ought to support Bonaparte. In early May 1859, Marx was on the platform of an Urquhartite meeting to protest at the supposed Russian menace caused by the war. Also on the platform was Karl Blind, who informed Marx that Voigt was being subsidized by Bonaparte, that he had attempted to bribe printers in Germany and London, and that he had recently been in secret conclave with Prince Jerome Bonaparte to forward the establishment of the Tsar's brother on the throne of Hungary. Marx mentioned these accusations to Allard Biskamp, editor of Das Volk, who promptly printed them and even sent a copy to Voigt. Das Volk was the successor to a small paper edited by Edgar Bauer on behalf of the German Workers' Education Association, which collapsed when Kinkel offered its printer a more lucrative contract to print his own paper. When asked by the association to accept a commission to step into the breach, Marx informed Engels that he had replied that no one but ourselves had bestowed on us our position as representatives of the Proletarian Party, but this position had been countersigned by the exclusive and universal hatred accorded us by all factions and parties of the Old World. But in spite of his decision 10 years previously to have nothing more to do with the association, Marx let himself be persuaded to support the paper, partly from compassion for the honest but incompetent Biskamp and partly from a desire to get at Kinkel. He refused at first to contribute directly to any paper he did not edit, but became increasingly involved, spent a lot of time and energy in organizing support for the paper, and, when it finally collapsed after little more than 3 months, had to meet the outstanding printer's bill himself in order to avoid a scandal. Thus Voigt had no difficulty in identifying Marx as the source of the attack on him and replied in kind in his own paper. The matter would have rested there had not Liebknecht discovered the galleys of an anonymous pamphlet repeating the accusations against Voigt, which was being printed on the same press as Das Volk and had, according to the typesetter, been handed in by Blind, whose handwriting he also claimed to have recognized in the proof corrections. Liebknecht sent off a copy to the Augsburger Allgemeine Zeitung, one of the leading conservative papers, for which he was London correspondent. On publication, Voigt prosecuted the Augsburger, which turned to Liebknecht for justification, who turned to Marx, who turned to Blind. Blind, however, refused to admit authorship of the pamphlet. Voigt's case against the Augsburger was dismissed on a legal technicality, though the fact that the defense had been unable to substantiate the accusations constituted a moral victory for him. This victory was enhanced by the publication in the Augsburger of a statement by Blind denying authorship of the pamphlet and supporting this with statements from the printer and typesetter whom he had suborned. Marx managed to secure an affidavit from the typesetter to the effect that the pamphlet really was in Blind's handwriting, and threatened Blind with prosecution. This produced a declaration in the Daily Telegraph that a friend of Blind's family, named Scheibli, had been the author of the pamphlet, and at least Marx was exonerated there, too. The matter might have rested had not Voigt produced a book entitled My Action Against the Allgemeine Zeitung. This included all the proceedings and documents of the trial, followed by a commentary that branded Marx as a forger and a blackmailer who lived off the contributions of the proletariat while only having respect for purebred aristocrats like his brother-in-law Ferdinand von Westphalen. The book sold all its first printing of 3,000 copies and immediately went into a second edition. The Berlin National Zeitung published 2 long leading articles drawn from Voigt's assertions, the arrival of which in London towards the end of January 1860 sent Marx into a panic. He tried to keep the news from Jenny, but of course she found out and was in a truly shattering state. Marx also quarreled violently with Freiligrath, with whom his relations had become increasingly strained. Freiligrath had refused to heed his warning not to participate in the Schiller Festival organized by Kinkel in November 1859, and he had dissociated himself abruptly from Das Buch when Liebknecht had mistakenly alleged that he was one of its collaborators. Marx's rage boiled over when he was informed again mistakenly that Voigt's book reprinted letters from Freiligrath that showed his intimacy with Voigt. When Marx realized how mistaken he was, he wrote to Freiligrath one of his most attractive letters. He claimed that his struggle against Voigt was decisive for the historical vindication of the party and its subsequent position in Germany, and continued, "I tell you frankly that I cannot decide to let irrelevant misunderstandings lose me one of the few men whom I have loved as a friend in the eminent sense of the word. If I am guilty of anything towards you, I am willing to make amends. Nihil humani amialienum puto." We both know that each of us in his own way, putting aside all private interest and from the purest motives, has held aloft for years over the heads of the Philistines the banner of the Klasslav plus Labrusitila plus miserable dash, and I would consider it a petty crime against history if we were to break up because of trifles that are all explainable as misunderstandings. Of Freiligrath accepted Marx's explanations, but replied, "My nature, like the nature of any poet, needs freedom. The party is also a cage, and it is easier to sing outside it, even for the party, than inside it." Marx was pleased with Freiligrath's reply, "Your letter pleased me a lot, for I give my friendship to only a very few men, but then I hold fast to it. My friends of 1844 are still the same." But he thought Freiligrath's interpretation of the party was much too narrow. After the League was dissolved in November 1852 on my proposition, I no longer belonged to any society whether secret or public, nor do I, thus the party in this completely ephemeral sense ceased to exist for me 8 years ago. Thus I know nothing of the party, in the sense of your letter, since 1852. If you are a poet, then I am a critic and had more than enough with the experiences of 1849 to 1852. The League, like 100 other societies, was only an episode in the history of the part, which grows everywhere spontaneously from the soil of modern society. Thus Marx and Freiligrath repaired their friendship, but it never became as intimate as previously, and all contact between the families was broken off by Jenny, who was, as Marx admitted, of an energetic nature. Meanwhile, Marx had begun a forlorn prosecution of the National Zeitung in Berlin and the Daily Telegraph in London, both dismissed for lack of evidence, and began to collect material for a refutation of Voigt. Voigt's attack, thought Marx, had been on a large scale, and a large-scale reply was needed, a reply which Marx also sought as a revenge for the Cologne trial of 1853. In March he went to Manchester for 6 weeks to check the archives of the Communist League in Engels' possession, as Voigt had stirred up all the foggy gossip of the refugees. He caused affidavits to be made left, right and center, fired off at least 50 letters, that to his lawyer in Berlin alone is 20 printed pages, and entered into a secret and confidential correspondence with the Daily Telegraph to try to get them to make amends. He started on the book in August but did not finish it until mid-November. Both Jenny and Engels disapproved of the delay and considered Marx's approach much too thorough. It proved impossible to find a publisher in Germany, and despite Engels' warnings, Marx decided on a London publisher for whom Marx's book was his first commercial enterprise. Marx even optimistically persuaded him to agree to share the profits. What with the cost of the lawsuits, gathering material and printing, Marx found that he had spent about £100, to which Engels and Lassalle had to contribute heavily. It took Marx a long time to decide on the title. He himself, supported by Jenny, favored Dita Voigt, apparently on the grounds that it would puzzle the Philistines, but Engels persuaded him to settle for the simpler Herr Voigt. The book was very long and described by Marx himself as a system of mockery and contempt. Voigt, pilloried as a reincarnation of Sir John Falstaff, was pursued through 200 closely printed pages whose style was so elusive that Engels recommended a resume after each chapter in order to present the general impression clearly to the Philistines. Marx was at his most vituperative. By means of an artificially hidden sewer system, all the lavatories of London spew their physical filth into the Thames. By means of the systematic pushing of goosequills, the world capital spews out all its social filth into the great papered central sewer called the Daily Telegraph. Having transformed the social filth of London into newspaper articles, Levy transforms the articles into copper, and finally the copper into gold. Over the gate leading to this central sewer made of paper there can be read these words written de color oscuro, hi. Quisquam faxit oletum / or as Byron so poetically translated it, wanderer, stop and piss. Marx read passages aloud to Jenny and she found them highly amusing. Engels thought it better than the 18th Brumaire, and Lassalle called it a masterpiece in all respects. However, few copies sold and subsequent generations have not shared the taste for vituperation so characteristic of mid-Victorian polemics. Disappointment at the book's failure was enhanced when the publisher went bankrupt and Marx was saddled with all the printing costs. 10 years later, following the abdication of Napoleon III, the final stroke was added to the tragicomedy. The French Provisional Government of 1870 published papers found in the Tuileries showing, almost beyond doubt, that Voigt did in fact receive subsidies from Napoleon and that Marx, for once in his career as a polemicist, was wholly justified. Marx and Lassalle. During the early 1860s, Marx's relationship to working-class politics in Germany was dominated by his relationship to Lassalle, which was typical of the ambivalence that characterized all Marx's personal relationships. The son of a self-made Jewish tailor and 7 years younger than Marx, Lassalle had become intimate with him during the 1848 Troubles. Throughout the 1850s, Lassalle had been extremely accommodating to Marx. He had offered to raise subscriptions to publish Marx's Economics and also got him his job as London correspondent of the Neue Oder Zeitung. But Marx was not the man to appreciate favors and lent a ready ear to a series of accusations against Lassalle delivered by one Levy, a self-styled representative of the Düsseldorf workers who had already tried to convince Marx in late 1853 that a revolution was imminent in the Rhineland and paid him a second visit in 1856. According to Levy, Lassalle was only using the working-class movement for his personal affairs. He had compromised himself with the liberals, betrayed the workers, and embezzled from friends. Engels was even readier than Marx to give credit to these accusations, although they were not supported by a shred of evidence, and recommended the breaking off of relations, declaring of Lassalle that his desire to push his way into polite society, to parvenir, to gloss over, if only for appearance's sake, the dirty Breslau Jew with all kinds of pomade and grease paint, was always disgusting. Marx refused to reply to Lassalle's letters thereafter and only gave him a short and cool answer when Lassalle offered him the possibility of writing articles for the Wiener Presse, whose editor was Lassalle's cousin. Marx was also looking for a publisher for his Economics, and it was Lassalle again who acted as a very competent literary agent in the negotiations with Franz Duncker, whose wife was Lassalle's mistress. Thus relations were temporarily restored. Marx complimented Lassalle on his recent publication Heraclitus, though he expressed himself differently to Engels, and Lassalle even turned to Marx for advice on the problem of dueling. Marx's curious reply was that, although dueling was irrational and a relic of a bygone culture, bourgeois society was so one-sided that, in opposition to it, certain feudal forms of expressing individuality are justified. This cooperation was, however, soon disturbed by differences of opinion on the Franco-Austrian War of 1859. Immediately on its outbreak, Engels had again through the agency of Lassalle published a pamphlet entitled Pine Rhine, in which he declared that Bonaparte was interfering in his own interests in North Italy preliminary to an attack on the Rhine. Lassalle also published a pamphlet, but his views were noticeably different. He considered that any purely nationalistic German war against France could only serve the cause of the reaction, which would be increased enormously by an Austrian victory. Bonaparte was a bad man, but the cause he was supporting was good, and anyway he was too weak to pose a serious threat to Germany. If it became plain that he had serious territorial designs in Italy, Prussia should retaliate with a war of liberation. In Schleswig-Holstein, Marx, who enthusiastically approved Engels' pamphlet and was obsessed by the fear of a Russian alliance with France and by the urgent necessity to unseat Bonaparte, called Lassalle's pamphlet an enormous blunder. He wrote to Engels, "We must now absolutely insist on party discipline or everything will be in the soup," and delivered Lassalle a long lecture on publishing his views without prior consultation. Events, however, showed that Lassalle had the more realistic view of the situation. What made Marx even more annoyed was that he thought that Lassalle's pamphlet had been given priority by Duncker over his own critique of political economy. And when Lassalle informed him of his intention to publish a 2-volume work on economics, he attributed the ignoring of his critique to Lassalle's influence, though he comforted himself with the thought that, to judge from Lassalle's Heraclitus, he would find to his cost that it is one thing to construct a critique of a science and thus for the first time to bring it to a point where a dialectic presentation is possible, and quite another to apply intimations of an abstract, ready-made system of logic. Lassalle had not replied to Marx's lecture on party discipline, but by January 1860 Marx felt the urgent need for assistance in his battle of words with Voigt and asked Engels to write Lassalle a diplomatic letter excusing his roughness. However, Lassalle refused to let himself be persuaded that Voigt was a Bonapartist agent. Although he sympathized with Marx's case, he thought it unwise to have attacked Voigt without firm proof. He also reproached Marx with his mistrust, whereupon Marx sent him from Manchester, where he was staying with Engels, an anonymous denunciation of Lassalle that he had received from Baltimore, and also informed him that official complaints from Düsseldorf were now in the party archives. Lassalle replied in a justified outburst, "Why do you send me this stuff with so triumphant a mien, so proud a gesture? In order to prove to me how little you at least are mistrustful of me, heavens! Not to believe such a cut-purse slander behind a man's back, but that is the most elementary of moral duties of man to man. To believe such slanders and such fatuities of me must be for any person of understanding, for anyone who knows the least thing about me, a physical impossibility. And you think that, by not believing it, you are doing me a favor? You want to impute that to yourself as a merit. The only conclusion I draw is a firm proof of your inclination to believe all possible evil of every man without evidence, if you count it as a merit, and think it proves something that in this case you did not believe." Marx realized that he had gone too far, and for the rest of 1861 he and Lassalle corresponded regularly and good-humoredly. At the beginning of 1861, when Marx was at last rid of Voigt, he began to toy with the idea of a definitive return to Prussia. In January 1861, Frederick William IV, who had been certified insane for the previous 2 years, died and was succeeded by his brother Wilhelm I, who immediately declared a political amnesty. The conditions of the amnesty were not good. It only applied to those who had been convicted by Prussian courts, and refugees had to rely on vague assurances. When Lassalle first proposed a renewal of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung backed by the money of his wealthy patron, the Countess von Hatzfeld, Marx was skeptical, thinking that the waves in Germany are not yet riding high enough to carry our ship. Engels suggested that Lassalle launch a weekly and that Marx cooperate if the money were good enough. Although chary of collaborating in anything under Lassalle's control, Marx's income from the New York Daily Tribune was decreasing dramatically owing to the Civil War, and he decided to go to Berlin to investigate possibilities. His financial straits obliged him in any case to go to Holland to see his uncle. Borrowing money for the trip from Lassalle, he spent 2 weeks in Zaltbommel with the Phillips. "I have never known a better family in my life," he wrote afterwards to his uncle, and managed to borrow £160 as an advance on his mother's estate. His uncle was, according to Marx, stubborn but very proud of my being an author, and Marx got Lassalle to write him the sort of letter that he could confidentially show to his uncle to increase his reputation. On his proceeding to Berlin, he was magnificently entertained for 3 weeks by Lassalle. He lived in a very beautiful house on one of the most beautiful streets of Berlin, and the Countess, too, made a favorable impression on Marx. She is a very distinguished lady, no blue stocking, of great natural intellect, much vivacity, deeply interested in the revolutionary movement, and of an aristocratic laissez-aller very superior to the pedantic grimaces of professional femmes d'esprit. There were visits to the theatre and the ballet, which bored Marx to death, and a dinner in Marx's honor where he was placed between the Countess and the niece of Varnhagen von Entz. "This Fräulein," he wrote to Antoinette Phillips, "is the most ugly creature I ever saw in my life, a nastily Jewish physiognomy, a sharply protruding thin nose, eternally smiling and grinning, always speaking poetical prose, playing at false enthusiasm, and spitting at her auditory during the trances of her ecstasis." Marx did, however, manage to persuade the Countess to start a press campaign against Blanquy's ill treatment by the French police. The visit was prolonged since Marx was applying, with Lassalle's active assistance, for the recovery of his Prussian citizenship, and the bureaucracy moved slowly. But Marx began to tire of Berlin society very quickly. "I am treated as a sort of lion and compelled to meet many professionally intellectual ladies and gentlemen." He found the whole of Berlin engulfed in ennui. Bickering with the police and the antipathy between civil and military authorities constituted the sum of Berlin politics. Marx attended a session in the Prussian Chamber of Deputies and found it a curious mixture of bureaucracy in the schoolroom. There was a general spirit of dissolution in the city. People of every rank thought a catastrophe inevitable, and the next elections would yield a parliament in opposition to the king. In these circumstances, Marx considered the time ripe for the foundation of a new paper, but he and Lassalle could not agree upon terms. Lassalle insisted that if Engels joined the editorial board in addition to himself and Marx, then Marx and Engels should have only one vote against his own. But, although Lassalle was supplying the money, Marx considered that he could only supply a useful service if he were kept under strong discipline. He wrote to Engels, dazzled by the reputation that he has gained in certain learned circles through his Heraclitus and in another circle of spongers through wine and cuisine. Lassalle is naturally unaware that he is discredited in the public at large. There is also his dogmatism, his obsession with the speculative concept. The fellow even dreams of his writing a new Hegelian philosophy, raised to the second power, his infection with old French liberalism, his arrogant pen, importunity, tactlessness, etc. In the end, Marx left Berlin without receiving his Prussian nationality, in spite of a personal interview with the Prussian chief of police, again arranged by Lassalle, and without a definite decision one way or another on the paper. Marx at least had the satisfaction of finding his old friend Koppen unchanged. The drinking session with Koppen did him a power of good, and Koppen presented him with his 2-volume study on the Buddha. Marx also visited old friends in the Rhineland and spent 2 days with his mother. She interested him with her subtle esprit and indestructible stability of character, and she cancelled some of his old debts into the bargain. Marx defined his attitude towards a return to Germany as follows: Germany is so fine a country that one is better living outside its boundaries. I, for my part, if I were quite free and not burdened with something that you might call political conscience, would never leave England for Germany, still less for Prussia, and least of all for this frightful Berlin with its dust and culture and overclever people. And Jenny's views were even sharper. My wife is particularly against a move to Berlin, Marx informed his uncle, since she does not wish our daughters to be introduced to the Hatzfeld circle, and it would be difficult to keep them away from it. The whole family was, however, enchanted by the gifts from Lassalle that Marx brought back with him. There was an atlas for Engels and cloaks for the girls and for Jenny, who strutted up and down so proudly in hers that Eleanor called after her, just like a peacock. Jenny was grateful for other reasons, too, as anything like this makes an impression on the Philistines of the neighborhood and earns us respect and credit. On his return to London, Marx failed to pursue any cooperation with Lassalle. He was too busy working on his economics and trying to spin out his meager earnings from journalism. The New York Daily Tribune had anyway cut Marx's quota of articles by half owing to the Civil War, and most of what Marx wrote was for the Viennese paper Die Presse, which praised his contributions highly but only printed and paid for 1 out of every 4 or 5. Many of these articles dealt with the American Civil War. Unlike Engels, Marx was confident that the North, being industrially more developed, would win in the end in spite of early setbacks. In this struggle, he wrote in the Tribune, the highest form that the self-government of a people has so far attained is giving battle to the lowest and most shameful form of human slavery yet seen in the annals of history. Marx was particularly pleased that the English working class, although their interests were damaged by the blockade of the South, were staunchly opposed to intervention. In July of the following year, Lassalle reciprocated by visiting London at a time when Marx had just returned from several weeks' refuge in Manchester to find a mass of debts. Lassalle stayed in the Marx household for 3 weeks and spent a lot of time at the International Exhibition. The strain that he imposed on Marx's finances, working time, and nerves made him extremely bitter. In order to preserve a certain facade, Marx wrote to Engels, "My wife had to take to the pawnbrokers everything that was not actually nailed down." It was all the more galling, therefore, that Lassalle had just thrown away almost £100 in speculation, and to see him spend more than £1 daily just on cabs and cigars. Marx was even more riled when Lassalle offered to obtain the protection of a London Jewish banker for him and take one of his daughters as a companion to the Countess. Marx wanted nothing more than to get on with his economics, but Lassalle coolly assumed that since the lack of a market for his articles meant that he had no job and was only doing theoretical work, then Marx had all the time in the world to kill with him. As annoying as Lassalle's flamboyant display of wealth was his boastfulness. In Marx's view, he had changed much since the previous year in Berlin. Lassalle's success had turned his head, and he is now not only confirmed as the greatest scholar, profoundest thinker, a genius in research, etc., he is also Don Juan and a revolutionary Cardinal Richelieu. And there is also his continual chatter in an unnatural falsetto voice, his ugly demonstrative gestures and didactic tone. And it must indeed have been difficult for Marx to tolerate long the company of a man who could, with complete self-assurance, begin a speech with the words, "Working men, before I leave for the spas of Switzerland." After 3 weeks of this, Marx gave vent to his pent-up frustration in a letter to Engels. "It is now quite clear to me that, as shown by the shape of his head and the growth of his hair, The situation in Germany than was Marx, might with justice have claimed that Marx overestimated the revolutionary potential of the Prussian bourgeoisie and that his own program represented the only way forward for the working class movement. Marx was equally opposed to the idea of universal suffrage in Germany. Lassalle had learnt none of the lessons of the manipulation of this political device in France by Louis Napoleon. He also claimed that Lassalle did not base himself enough on previous working-class movements in Germany, though in fact many of his collaborators were former members of the Communist League, and that Lassalle had no international dimension to his political agitation. This last observation was certainly justified. Lassalle had never lived outside Germany, and both his theory and his practice were strictly limited to German conditions. Even after his visit to London, Lassalle still hankered after the idea of editing a newspaper in cooperation with Marx. But Marx's criticisms became even more pronounced during Lassalle's last year of feverish political activity. In May 1863, Lassalle's agitation culminated in a request from the Leipzig workers to attend a conference where the Allgemeine Deutsche Arbeiterverein, General Union of German Workers, the first effective German Socialist Party, was formed. 11 days before the conference, Lassalle had had an interview with Bismarck, with whom he had already been in secret negotiation. Although Lassalle claimed that he was eating cherries with Bismarck, but Bismarck was getting only the stones, Lassalle did not live long enough for it to be clear whether he was right. Marx himself very quickly came to the conclusion that Lassalle had sold out to Bismarck and complained even more strongly of his plagiarizing the Communist Manifesto and Wage Labor and Capital. But Lassalle's sudden death intervened. On August 28, 1864, he was mortally wounded in a duel by a Wallachian count, the fiancée of Helen von Donnages, a 17-year-old girl to whom Lassalle had got himself engaged barely 4 weeks before. Engels received the news fairly coolly. Marx showed more humanity. He wrote, "Lassalle's misfortune has been going damnably round in my head these last days. He was after all one of the old stock and the enemy of our enemies." Also, the thing came so surprisingly that it is difficult to believe that so noisy, stirring, pushing a man is now as dead as a mouse and must shut his mouth altogether. About the cause of his death you are quite right. It is one of the many tactlessnesses which he performed in his life. For all that, I'm sorry that our relationship was troubled during the last years, of course through his fault. The devil knows, the crowd is getting ever smaller and no new blood is being added, and to the Countess, he wrote, "You will understand how the quite unforeseen news of Lassalle's death has astonished, shocked, and shattered me. He was one of those for whom I had a great affection. Be convinced that no one can feel deeper grief than I at his being torn away. And above all I feel for you. I know what the departed was to you, what his loss means to you. Rejoice over one thing. He died young, in triumph, like Achilles. Although Marx was obviously overgenerous here to his own past sentiments, yet his relationship to Lassalle was ambivalent, resentment and hate always being tempered by a grudging admiration. Life in Grafton Terrace, the years 1860 to 63 had marked a fresh but final low in Marx's domestic affairs. He touched the depth of bourgeois misery and could manage no more in 3 years than research on the historical portions of his economics. In 1864, however, the situation changed. 2 legacies gave the Marx household enough security for Marx to be able to devote himself to the spread of the First International, which had been founded just 4 weeks after Lassalle's death, and also to start drafting the vital chapters of his economics on capital. As Marx had foreseen, the poverty that the family experienced in Grafton Terrace was in many ways worse than that of Dean Street. The building had, according to Jenny, the 4 characteristics the English like in a house: airy, sunny, dry, and built in gravelly soil, and on a fine day there was a clear view right down to St. Paul's. But the Marxes lived a very isolated life, as their house was, initially, very difficult of access. Building was going on all round, there was no made-up road leading to it, and in rainy weather the sticky red soil turned into a quagmire. This particularly affected Jenny, who wrote that it was a long time before I could get used to the complete solitude. I often missed the long walks I had been in the habit of making in the crowded West End streets, the meetings, the clubs, and our favorite public house, and homely conversations which had so often helped me to forget the worries of life for a time. Luckily I still had the article for the Tribune to copy out twice a week, and that kept me in touch with world events. Even worse, there were more appearances to be kept up and expenditure much increased, particularly with the elder children going to school at ladies' seminary and having private lessons in French, Italian, drawing and music. A piano, too, had to be rented. From 1857 there was a second servant, Helene Demuth's younger sister, Marianne, who stayed until her death in 1862. Marx was as resolved as ever to pursue my aim through thick and thin and not let bourgeois society turn me into a money-making machine, but was often rather naively surprised at the financial difficulties that his attitude entailed. In 1859 he hoped to double his revenue by an offer that Lassalle had negotiated on his behalf to write for the Wiener Presse, and announced to Engels that he would bother him no more for money. Jenny, who was always much more hard-headed about money, warned him that he could count on £2 a week maximum and should not believe Engels with his airy talk of £10. The following September his affairs were in a crisis. Engels, who was being prosecuted for assaulting someone in a pub with his umbrella, had to find about £50 to settle the case, and Marx turned to Lassalle, assuring him that he would be able to recoup from the royalties of the Critique of Political Economy. At the end of the year things were so bad that Jenny had to write secretly to her brother Ferdinand, with whom she had kept on fairly friendly terms, though all she gained was a feeling that she had compromised her principles, as he refused her request, saying that he had only his pension to live on. The year 1860 was slightly better, as Engels' financial position was improving and he was able to send Marx £100 in a lump sum. But a lot of money went on the quarrel with Karl Voigt, and by the end of the year Engels was having to borrow money to bail Marx out, though his own income was diminished by the American Civil War. In February 1861 Marx decided, on his way to see Lassalle in Berlin, to visit his uncle in Holland and try to anticipate his inheritance. This trip was preceded by 2 weeks in which Marx spent his whole time in avoiding the complete breakup of the house. He could only keep sane by reading in the evening Zappian on the Roman Civil War. His favorite figure was Spartacus, the finest fellow produced by the whole of classical history, a real representative of the ancient proletariat. This admiration was matched by a complete contempt for Pompey, a pure louse of a man, into whose character Shakespeare in Love's Labours Lost had some real insights. By the summer the £160 that he had got from his uncle was gone. He felt the situation to be in every respect unsettled and was reading Thucydides to shake off his ill humor. "At least these ancients remain forever new," he remarked to LaSalle. In the autumn he renewed his correspondence with the New York Daily Tribune and at last obtained terms that enabled him to start writing for the Wiener Presse. This work for New York and Vienna would give him enough to live on, he considered, but his debts still amounted to £100. "It is astonishing," he remarked naively to Engels, "how lack of income together with debts that are never completely cleared blows up the old shit in spite of all assistance in minor matters." The year 1862 marked the nadir of Marx's fortunes. He had to pretend not to have returned from a trip to Manchester in order to avoid creditors, and Jenny even tried to sell his books. In such circumstances LaSalle's visit in July could only be excruciating. LaSalle had come to the rescue with £60, but by the autumn Marx was thinking of taking a job in a railway office. He went as far as getting an interview but was turned down owing to his appalling handwriting. In January 1863 he wrote Engels that the recent trouble had at last brought my wife to agree to a suggestion that I made a long time ago and which, with all its inconveniences, is not only the sole solution, but is also preferable to the life of the last 3 years, and particularly the last, as well as restoring our self-esteem. I will write to all my creditors, with the exception of the landlord, and say that, if they do not leave me in peace I will declare myself bankrupt. My 2 eldest daughters will get positions as governess for the Cunningham family. Lenchen will enter another service and I, with my wife and Tussie, will go and live in the same city model lodging house in which Red Wolf and his family lived previously. It is not clear how serious Marx really was, but Engels read the letter as a cry for help and responded immediately by borrowing £100 at great risk to himself. Marx still had to go off to the British Museum to avoid his creditors, but in the summer Ernst Drunk lent Engels £250 for Marx, which lasted until December when he received the telegram that presaged substantial relief. His mother was dead or borrowing the money from Engels. Marx rushed to try her, but the administrative measures concerning the execution of the will took so long that Marx left to visit his uncle in Zaltbommel. During the week he spent in Trier, he wrote to Jenny, "He went back to the old house of the Westphalians that was of more interest to me than all the Roman antiquities because it reminds me of the happiest time of my youth and housed my greatest treasure. Moreover, I was asked daily, left and right, after the former prettiest girl in Trier and the queen of the ball. It is damned pleasant for a man when his wife lives on like that in the imagination of a whole city as an enchanted princess." Most of the money, of which Marx's share was about £1,000, was in the hands of Marx's uncle, who was the executor of the will as well as being his chief creditor. Here also the legal processes were long, but Marx only had time to visit 2 of his aunts in Frankfurt before he was struck down by a monster carbuncle which kept him in Zaltbommel for 6 weeks, nursed by his uncle and cousin Antoinette Phillips. Engels meanwhile paid the bills for Grafton Terrace. Marx considered the stay in Holland as one of the happiest episodes of my life, and returned to London on February 19, after visits to more relations in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, in possession of the residue of the money left him by his mother. Some additional money was sent later as a result of the sale of objects in Trier. In early May 1864 Marx obtained another windfall. On May 9 Wilhelm Wolff died. Marx felt that he had lost one of our few friends and fellow fighters, a man in the best sense of the word. Marx was at his bedside during the days before his death and gave a brief speech at his graveside. As one of the executors of Wolff's will he stayed on in Manchester for some days and was as surprised as anyone when it was discovered that Wolff had painstakingly accumulated a small fortune and left the bulk of it £843 and some £50 worth of effects to Marx. This put a stop to begging letters to Engels for just over 1 year. These continued financial disasters weighed upon the whole household, but most of all on the sensitive and house-proud Jenny, whose health became seriously undermined. In late 1856 she was again pregnant, at the age of 42, and needed the doctor's attention throughout the 9 months during which her nervous state neared what Marx described as catastrophe. The child was born dead. The following year Jenny went to Ramsgate with Lenchen and the children for several weeks to recuperate, and this eventually became an annual occurrence. The Marx family had great faith in the health of sea air, and at one time or another visited practically every resort on the southeast coast. In Ramsgate Jenny had, so Marx informed Engels, made acquaintance with refined and, horrible dictu, intelligent English ladies. After the experience of bad society, or none at all, for years on end, the society of her equals seems to suit her. With her health, Jenny's optimism also declined. At the end of 1858, when she had no money for the Christmas festivities and was busy copying out the Critique of Political Economy, she informed Marx that after all the misery that she would have had to endure, it would be even worse in the revolution and she would experience the pleasure of seeing all the present-day humbugs again celebrate their triumphs. In November 1860, the year that Marx spent in his fruitless campaign against Karl Voigt, Jenny contracted the disease that was to mark a watershed in her life. Hardly had she finished copying the manuscript of her Voigt, then she was struck down by a fever. Diagnosis was delayed as Jenny refused at first to call a doctor. After 2 visits, the very nasty nervous fever was declared to be smallpox contracted in spite of a double vaccination. The children had to go and stay with the Liebknechts for several weeks. They would not go to a boarding school because of the religious rites. Marx hired a nurse to look after Jenny, who had lost the use of her senses. She wrote later, "I lay constantly by the open window so that the cold November air would blow over me, while there was a raging fire in the stove and burning ice on my lips, and I was given drops of claret from time to time. I could hardly swallow, my hearing was getting weaker, and finally my eyes closed, so that I did not know whether I would remain enveloped in eternal night." In these circumstances, Marx could only preserve his quietness of mind by absorbing himself in the study of mathematics. Eventually the crisis passed and by Christmas the children were allowed back in the house. But the illness had after effects. Jenny remained fairly deaf and her skin was marked with red pox that took a long time to heal. In March of the following year, she wrote to Louise Weidmeyer that before her illness she had had no gray hair and my teeth and figure were good, and therefore people used to class me among well-preserved women. But that was all a thing of the past now, and I seem to myself now a kind of cross between a rhinoceros and hippopotamus whose place was in the zoo rather than among the members of the Caucasian race. Her nervous state also continued to frighten the doctor, particularly in times of financial trouble. Marx found that his financial difficulties and Jenny's increasing irritability made family life very difficult. By the end of December 1857, when he was well into the Grundrisse, Jenny reported the return of his freshness and cheerfulness, which he had lost with the death of Edgar. But 2 months later he declared to Engels, "There is no greater stupidity than for people of general aspirations to marry and so surrender themselves to the small miseries of domestic and private life." The life in Grafton Terrace was a very isolated one, with only the Freilagrats as close friends and very few family visitors, and Marx felt that Engels was the only person he could talk to frankly, as at home he had to play the role of a silent stoic. This was necessary to combat Jenny's increasing pessimism. Marx's own health was seriously suffering. He continually complained to Engels that his liver bothered him for weeks on end. His father had died from a liver complaint, and he consumed enormous quantities of medicine to heal the toothache, headaches, and disorders of his eyes and nerves. The boils were to follow shortly after Jenny's illness. Domestic troubles were aggravated. Marx tried to keep bad news from Jenny, as such news always induces a sort of paroxysm. The year 1862 he could only wish to the devil, since such a lousy life is not worth while living. Jenny's feelings were much the same.